"You're nothing but a useless freeloader." That was the sentence Daniel shouted directly in his wife's face in front of friends, family, and even their children. For years, he belittled her, controlled every decision she made, and convinced her that she couldn't survive without him. But behind the image of a successful husband, Daniel was secretly preparing a far more ruthless plan to take control of all their assets and win custody of the children at any cost. But that wasn't even the worst part. Then one night, after accidentally overhearing a conversation she was never supposed to hear, she uncovered a horrifying secret that shattered everything she had ever believed in an instant. What I heard that night changed everything. Daniel thought victory was already in the bag. What he didn't know was that just a few weeks later, he would be the one who lost everything. And the final twist was so shocking that no one in the courtroom could believe it. But before I continue, you need to know how this story began. Close quote. Megan was 47 years old. She lived with her husband and 2 children in a quiet suburb of Denver. From the outside, her life looked like something many people dreamed of. She had a spacious home with a beautifully maintained garden, regular family dinners, and a successful husband. Neighbors often said that Megan was the definition of a lucky woman. She didn't have to work, had plenty of time to care for her family, and seemed to have nothing to worry about. Every morning, Megan woke up before everyone else. She prepared breakfast for the children, cleaned the house, and made sure everything was organized before Daniel left for work. Her life revolved around her family. Few people knew that behind that peaceful appearance were years of sacrifices that most people would never have been willing to make. 20 years earlier, Megan had not been a full-time homemaker. She had been a promising financial analyst at a large company. Her colleagues considered her intelligent, meticulous, and destined for a bright future. She earned a good salary, had clear opportunities for advancement, and genuinely loved her work. But when Daniel began building his own career, Megan made a decision that would change the course of her life. She left her job to take care of the family and support her husband as he grew his company. When their children were born, she continued putting her personal ambitions on hold to become the person who kept the household running smoothly. For many years, Megan believed those sacrifices were worth it. She believed that Daniel's success was their success. And indeed, Daniel exceeded everyone's expectations. From an ambitious entrepreneur, he became the CEO of a rapidly growing company. People admired him. Friends praised him as a model of hard work and success. At social gatherings, Daniel was always the center of attention. But as his wealth and status grew, something else began to change as well. The man who had once appreciated his wife's sacrifices gradually became colder. The words of encouragement disappeared, replaced by contempt and remarks that cut deeply into Megan. Even so, Megan continued to believe in her marriage. She believed that someday things would get better. Even then, I thought that day would be just another ordinary day. It was late summer in Denver, and our neighborhood was holding its annual barbecue, just like every year. Kids ran across the lawns, the smell of grilled food filled the air, and adults gathered in small groups around folding tables set up in backyards. Daniel always loved events like that. He loved being the center of attention. That evening was no exception. I was setting a plate of cookies on the table when I heard someone ask, "Daniel, what's your secret to success?" Everyone laughed. Daniel raised his beer. "Well, it definitely isn't, Megan." A few people laughed along. I forced a smile. But Daniel wasn't finished. Honestly, if Megan were running my company, we'd probably be bankrupt within a week. The laughter was louder this time. I looked down at the plate in my hands. One of the neighbors glanced at me for a moment, then quickly looked away. Maybe she thought the comment had gone a little too far. But no one said anything. And as always, I told myself, he's just joking. I had repeated those words to myself so many times that I had almost started believing them. But as we drove home through the quiet suburban streets, that uneasy feeling refused to go away. I wish it had ended there. A few weeks later, I met an old friend at a cafe near downtown Denver. We had worked together in finance many years earlier. Even after nearly 20 years, we had stayed in touch. "You were always so talented," she said. "Have you ever thought about going back to work?" To be honest, I had. The kids were older now. I was beginning to want a life of my own again. That evening, I brought it up to Daniel over dinner. He set down his fork. Go back to work? Yeah, just thinking about it. Daniel laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from amusement, the kind that makes you feel like you've just said something ridiculous. Megan, you've been out of the industry for almost 20 years. I know. The market is completely different now. Of course it is. Who do you think is going to hire you? The kitchen fell silent. I didn't answer. I don't want to hurt your feelings, Daniel continued, but you need to be realistic. That night, for the first time, I felt that he no longer saw me as a partner. He saw me as a burden. That was when I started to realize something was changing. Then came the little things. At least at first, I thought they were little things. Daniel started taking his phone everywhere. Whenever the screen lit up, he immediately turned it face down. Phone calls often ended the moment I walked into the room. Business trips became more frequent. Chicago, Phoenix, Dallas, then Chicago again. There were nights when I sat alone in the living room, listening to the ticking clock on the wall, while the only light outside the window came from the pale yellow glow of the street lamps. I tried to come up with reasonable explanations for everything. Work pressure, new clients, company expansion. I wanted to believe those explanations. But deep down, a sense of unease kept growing stronger with each passing day. And I had no idea that what I was seeing was only the tip of the iceberg. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. Everything changed on a Thursday evening. Daniel said he needed to stop by the office to prepare for an investor meeting the following morning. That wasn't unusual. In recent years, working late had become a regular part of his routine. Around 8 o'clock that night, I drove downtown to bring him the laptop he said he had accidentally left at home. The office building was nearly empty. The long hallway was illuminated by cold, sterile white lights. I walked toward the conference room at the end of the corridor and was about to knock on the door. Then I heard Daniel's voice. I was about to walk in, but one sentence stopped me cold. We need to prove that she's incapable of managing her own finances. I froze. Another voice inside the room replied, all the documentation is being prepared. If everything goes according to plan, it shouldn't be difficult. My heart started pounding. I thought I must have heard wrong. Then Daniel spoke again. If she's deemed incompetent, everything becomes much easier. Everything. Not one thing. Everything. The money, the assets, the decision-making power, maybe even the children. I felt my hands go cold. The laptop nearly slipped from my grasp. I stood frozen outside that door. And in that moment, a memory from years ago suddenly came rushing back. When Daniel wanted to start his business, we had almost nothing except a dream. I still remember our first small apartment. It was the most valuable thing I had ever owned. When the bank refused Daniel's business loan application, I was the one who suggested selling the apartment. Are you sure? He asked as we signed the paperwork. We're a team, aren't we? I remember smiling. That money became the initial capital that helped Daniel's company survive its early days. At the time, I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I saw it as love. Then another memory surfaced. The sleepless nights when one of the kids had a fever, the countless school drop-offs and pickups, the parent-teacher conferences where I was always the only one who showed up. While Daniel traveled across the country building his career, I missed opportunities for promotion, missed job offers, missed the ambitious version of myself I once knew. But I always believed that family came first. I always believed those sacrifices would be appreciated. When I returned to the present, I was still standing in that empty hallway. The voices inside the room now sounded clearer than ever. Suddenly, all the pieces started falling into place. The insults, the business trips, the secrets, the countless times he made me question my own abilities. Maybe they weren't isolated incidents after all. Maybe they were all part of the same plan. And the thought that terrified me most was realizing that the plan might have started a very long time ago. This wasn't the first time they had done something like this. After that night at the office, I tried to convince myself that maybe I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe the conversation had nothing to do with me. Maybe Daniel was simply dealing with some issue at the company. I wanted to believe that. But then things started happening too quickly and too systematically. Just a few weeks later, I began noticing strange looks from people I knew around the neighborhood. One morning at a coffee shop near my house, a woman I had always been friendly with suddenly seemed uneasy. "Are you doing okay, Megan?" she asked. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Nothing." But I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, a close friend finally told me the truth. "Someone's been saying you're having mental health issues." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who said that?" She didn't answer immediately, but I didn't need to hear the answer. I already knew. Daniel. Suddenly, I understood why people had started looking at me with sympathy instead of respect, why casual questions were becoming more frequent, and why he constantly referred to me as forgetful, overly emotional, or unstable whenever other people were around. It wasn't accidental. It was a campaign. A narrative was being carefully constructed, and I was the villain in that story. Before I could even process that shock, I discovered something else. One afternoon, I logged into our joint bank account to pay some bills. My password no longer worked. I tried again, then a third time. Still nothing. I called the bank. After several minutes of verification, the representative replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your access permissions have been changed. I'd like to restore them. We're unable to do that without approval from the primary account holder." The primary account holder? Daniel. I sat motionless in my car in the Target parking lot, watching people come and go without really seeing any of them. The investment accounts, the credit cards, various financial records. One by one, they were disappearing from my control. That was when all the pieces finally came together. I was beginning to understand his real plan. But the most painful part was still ahead. One weekend evening, I overheard my son ask, "Mom, do you really see a doctor because of anxiety?" I looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" He lowered his head. "Dad said you're going through a difficult time." A few days later, my daughter started becoming more distant too. Not because she didn't love me, but because someone was quietly changing the way she saw her mother. I realized that Daniel wasn't just preparing for a divorce. He was preparing for a war. And his goal was to convince everyone that I was incapable of making decisions about my own life, incapable of being a mother, incapable of managing finances, incapable of being heard. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The house was completely silent. For the first time in months, I stopped trying to make excuses for him. I stopped wondering whether I had misunderstood. I stopped defending him. That was the moment I stopped playing defense. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mailbox. The name of a law firm was printed on the front. I opened it right there at the kitchen table. Inside were pages filled with dense legal language, a divorce petition, demands regarding the division of assets, statements questioning my ability to manage financial matters. The wording was carefully crafted, but the message was crystal clear. They wanted to intimidate me. They wanted me to surrender. They wanted me to accept the future they had already planned for me. I stared at the stack of documents on the table. Then I looked out the window and saw Daniel's car slowly pulling into the garage. He stepped out looking perfectly calm, confident, relaxed, like a man who had already calculated every possible move. And in his mind, the game had probably been over for a long time. They thought they had already won. 2 days after receiving the divorce papers, I had barely slept. Every morning, I still made coffee, cleaned the house, and did my best to keep things normal for the kids. But deep down, I knew my old life was falling apart piece by piece. I was sitting alone in the kitchen around 6 in the morning when my phone buzzed. An unknown number, no contact name, no profile picture, just a short message. "Don't sign anything." I stared at the screen. My heart started beating faster. I replied almost immediately. "Who is this?" No response. 10 minutes passed. 20 minutes. Nothing. I told myself it was probably some kind of prank. Then my phone buzzed again. "Daniel hasn't told you the whole truth." I jumped to my feet. My chair scraped across the tile floor with a harsh screech. This time, I called the number directly. The call wouldn't go through. I looked out the window toward the street in front of the house. For some reason, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. But at the same time, another question entered my mind. Who was sending me these messages? The next day, another text appeared. "If you want the truth, meet me at the coffee shop in Cherry Creek at 2 p.m. Come alone." I almost didn't go. I really didn't, but in the end, curiosity won. That afternoon, I drove into the city. The entire way there, I kept checking my rearview mirror as if someone might be following me. The moment I walked into the coffee shop, I recognized the man sitting in the corner. It was Richard, a former senior executive at Daniel's company. He had left the company more than a year earlier. "I know what you're thinking," he said as soon as I sat down. "And no, I'm not here to help Daniel." I stayed silent. Richard lowered his voice. "You need to understand that what's happening didn't start recently." He glanced around before continuing. "There are things that happened at the company that you were never supposed to know about." My throat suddenly felt dry. "If you know something, why are you telling me now?" Richard sighed. Several seconds passed before he answered. I stayed silent for too long. Then he slid a small object across the table, a black USB drive. I looked at it, then back at him. One question immediately came to mind. Why is he helping me? Richard didn't answer directly. He simply said, "What's on that drive could change everything." After he left, I remained at the table alone for several more minutes. The USB drive sat in the palm of my hand. Small, ordinary, yet somehow it felt incredibly heavy. That night, I waited until everyone in the house was asleep. I locked the door to the home office, closed the blinds, then plugged the USB drive into my computer. Dozens of folders appeared on the screen: internal emails, financial reports, meeting records. And the more files I opened, the more I realized that some of the numbers didn't match anything Daniel had ever publicly reported. I sat motionless in front of the monitor. This was much bigger than a divorce. Much bigger than anything I had ever imagined. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid anymore. I felt something else. Hope. I knew everything was about to change. That night, I barely slept. The laptop sat on the dining room table. A notebook lay beside it. Outside the window, the Denver suburbs had long since fallen silent. But in my mind, everything was just beginning. I opened each folder on the USB drive. At first, the documents looked completely ordinary. Revenue reports, meeting minutes, payment records. Then I started noticing unusual transfers. Companies whose names I had never heard before. Transactions worth tens of thousands of dollars. Payments that appeared in one report and vanished from the official records. I grabbed a calculator, checked the numbers again. Once, then twice. The more I checked, the less sense everything made. I sat frozen in front of the screen. The pale blue glow of the monitor was the only light reflecting across the table. One question kept repeating in my mind. Where did the money go? The next morning, I dug even deeper. A personnel list appeared in one of the older folders. I recognized several names. People who had worked at the company for years. People who had suddenly disappeared. In the past, Daniel had always said they left voluntarily to pursue new opportunities. But the internal emails told a different story. Some had been forced out. Some had objected to certain financial decisions. Some had raised concerns about legal risks. Then their records abruptly ended. No explanation. No official announcement. No trace. I thought back to Richard's face in that coffee shop. Maybe he wasn't the only one who knew. Maybe there were many others who had quietly disappeared from the picture. And then another question sent a chill down my spine. What were they hiding? 3 days later, Richard called me. He said only one short sentence. People are starting to ask questions. Who? A reporter. I sat up straight. According to Richard, a local investigative journalist had contacted several former employees. A few of them had finally agreed to speak. What had once been rumors was now beginning to attract real attention. I stared at the phone in my hand. If this information was accurate, everything could change very quickly. But another thought immediately followed. Daniel was the kind of person who always controlled the situation, always stayed several steps ahead of everyone else. If an investigation was underway, did Daniel already know? The strange thing was that he continued acting as though nothing had happened. During meetings with attorneys, Daniel appeared almost unnervingly calm, not worried, not angry, not defensive. One afternoon at a law office, I spotted him at the far end of the hallway. He was laughing, even joking around with his legal team. Meanwhile, I had barely slept for weeks. That confidence unsettled me more than any threat ever could. Because people like Daniel are never confident without a reason. I began asking myself, why is he still so calm? Then the date of the first court hearing finally approached. The entire week leading up to it was suffocatingly tense. My phone never stopped ringing. Lawyers kept sending emails. New documents were added every day. I was practically living inside stacks of paperwork. The evening before the hearing, I sat alone in the kitchen. The coffee in front of me had gone cold hours ago. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees in the backyard. I knew that tomorrow would change my life one way or another. But there was still one thing I didn't know. One thing no one would tell me. Richard, my attorney, even the reporter. They all kept saying the same thing. Just wait until tomorrow. And that question kept echoing through my mind. Who was going to show up? The next morning, I walked into the courthouse. The hallway was far more crowded than I had expected. Attorneys moved back and forth. Court staff continuously called out case names. The sound of footsteps echoed across the stone floors. I took a deep breath. Inside the courtroom, Daniel was already seated. He still wore that same confident expression, that same familiar smile. But then a small movement near the back of the room caused everyone to turn their heads at once. Someone had just entered. I looked toward the door, and at that exact moment, the door began to open. The courtroom door opened. At first, no one thought much of it. People glanced up briefly and then returned to their paperwork. But a few seconds later, the entire atmosphere in the room began to shift. The quiet conversations faded. Several attorneys looked up. Even the judge turned toward the door. 3 people walked in. Simple business attire, thick case files in their hands, serious expressions on their faces. I immediately noticed Daniel's reaction. For the first time in months, he didn't look confident. He leaned toward his attorney, said something quickly. His attorney immediately frowned. Meanwhile, I remained seated, completely unsure of what was happening, until the man leading the group introduced himself. He was a federal investigator. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Someone in the back let out a sharp breath. A pen clattered to the floor. I could hear every small sound in the room. And for the first time, Daniel was no longer the one in control. The documents began to be presented. The screen at the front of the courtroom lit up. Internal emails appeared first. Messages exchanged between Daniel and his associates. Conversations he had never imagined would become public. Then came the financial records, the wire transfers, the intermediary companies, the accounts I had never even known existed. With each new document, the atmosphere grew heavier. I glanced over at Daniel. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was no longer leaning back comfortably in his chair. The color was beginning to drain from his face. Then came the evidence that truly silenced the room. The emails related to the divorce, the strategic discussions, the notes outlining how to portray me as incompetent, the plans designed to secure an overwhelming advantage in court. Line after line appeared on the screen. No explanation was necessary. Everyone understood exactly what they meant. But just when I thought it was over, my attorney stood up. He picked up another set of documents. Then he said, "Your Honor, there is one final piece of evidence." The entire courtroom turned to look. I felt my heart pounding. Even Daniel looked up. And then the document appeared, and then the final document appeared. It was a record showing that the plan to isolate me from our assets and financial decision-making had been prepared long before the divorce petition was ever filed. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It wasn't a marital dispute that had spiraled out of control. It was a calculated plan. I looked toward the judge. For hours, he had maintained a completely neutral expression. But now, that had changed. He began asking a very different set of questions that Daniel's side could no longer answer so easily. The momentum in the courtroom shifted so quickly that I could hardly believe it. The woman who had been portrayed as unstable, the woman who had been described as incapable, was now the only person being fully supported by the evidence. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not because I was angry, but because I was relieved. After months of being doubted, isolated, and diminished, the truth was finally being seen. And Daniel, the man who had believed he controlled everything, could do nothing but sit in silence and watch his plans collapse right in front of him. For months, I had grown accustomed to seeing Daniel in complete control of every situation. He was always the most confident person in the room, the one who always had an answer, the one who could always make others believe he held all the cards. But now, that man had almost disappeared. I looked across the courtroom at the opposing table. Daniel's face had turned noticeably pale. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes darted constantly between the screen and the stacks of documents in front of him. For the first time, he couldn't look anyone directly in the eye. The hands resting on the table had begun to tremble slightly. Not much, but enough for everyone to notice. That wasn't confidence anymore. It was panic. Beside him, even his legal team had started to change their demeanor. The attorneys who had entered the courtroom projecting absolute certainty were now passing documents back and forth in hurried silence. One lawyer stood up to object. Another requested a recess to review additional evidence. They were trying to contain the damage, trying to find a way out, but every answer only seemed to make things worse. The room was beginning to understand what was happening. The observers started looking at Daniel differently. No longer as the admired CEO everyone respected. No longer as the polished executive who stood on stages delivering impressive speeches. That image was collapsing right in front of them. One layer at a time, one truth at a time. And what stayed with me most wasn't the legal arguments. It was the moment Daniel looked around the courtroom. As if, for the first time, he realized that no one believed the story he had spent so long building. When it was all over, I kept the one thing that mattered most. My children. Not because I won a battle, but because the truth was finally given a chance to be heard. A few months later, life slowly began to return to normal. I drove my kids to school every morning. I made my own decisions without constantly worrying about what someone else might think. There was no celebration, no revenge, no dramatic movie-worthy moment of triumph. Just a sense of peace that I had lost a very long time ago. And then I realized the most important lesson of all. A person's worth does not disappear simply because someone else fails to see it. For years, I had tried to prove that I was good enough, smart enough, worthy enough, important enough. But that day, I finally understood that I didn't have to do that anymore. I don't need to prove my worth to people who never chose to see it in the first place. That day, I didn't lose a family. I simply stopped asking for permission to be myself.